you haven't seen our Ryzen content since the initial R7 reviews, note that we ran a Ryzen Revisit series which found game updates had improved gaming performance in some titles. We'll be including that data in our new tests alongside Intel retests for the same games. Also, in case you missed it, our VR benchmark for the R7 versus i7 provides our first in-depth virtual reality test with Rift and Vive. We'll be performing similar tests for the R5 CPUs this week. For now, though, we're reviewing the R5 1600X and 1500X CPUs in the Ryzen family, priced at $250 and $190 respectively. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by the 1080SC, which has a new MSRP that is lowered with the launch of the 1080 Ti series. The 1080 and 1060 SC cards come with For Honor or Ghost Recon Wildlands, which you can choose at checkout. Learn more at the link in the description below. So just to recap everyone on the Ryzen 7 Revisit content, we tested a few things there. Standalone EFI updates, which yielded no performance benefit without taking advantage of the higher memory frequency permitted by those EFI updates. We tested the higher memory frequencies up to 3466 at the time, though we can now hit 3600 on some platforms, more on that later. And then we also tested Windows updates standalone, which yielded no performance benefit. Going from B693 to B970 didn't magically fix things. In fact, it was the game updates, which happened to coincide with the Windows updates, that actually improved performance. And for Total War Warhammer, that was noteworthy. For Battlefield 1, there was a performance uplift. These performance uplifts also applied to Intel, which we have now partially retested. We'll note in the charts which ones haven't been retested yet. So we've got that. We retested Ryzen 7 for this benchmark of R5s, just as a note. These are not recycled numbers from the original review. And we have the EFI update on the Crosshair 6, along with 3200 megahertz memory for Ryzen 5 for the Ryzen 7 retest in gaming. But for the synthetics and Blender, we're still on 2933 megahertz for the R7s. We're on 3200 for the R5s. And then Intel has remained on the frequencies defined in the article linked in the description below, which contains all the test notes and some additional tests in the synthetic and gaming categories. We've got the CPU specs on the screen now, at least the basics. The 1600X is a 6-core, 12-thread part with a 3.6 gigahertz base frequency and 95 watt TDP at $250. The R5 1500X, our other review part, is a 4-core, 8-thread unit at 3.5 gigahertz base. We don't yet have the R5 1400 on this chart or R5 1600 CPUs. And because these new R5 CPUs are still using 2 CCXs, just with some of the cores disabled, that means memory frequency will still matter here when the Infinity Fabric, as AMD calls it, lags behind in cross-CCX transactions. So memory speed will still matter quite a lot for R5 CPUs. It's not just an R7 thing, because we're not looking at a single CCX for these units. It's 2 of them, for the most part, with cores disabled. That noted, the methodology, as always, will be linked in the description below in the article. We have updated that with our Ryzen Revisit info. The VR stuff is coming shortly, a bit later from this, because it needs to be a completely standalone video. It's very in-depth stuff. And then a final note here, we are adding error bars to some of the charts here. It was added for our VR tests. People liked them a lot. So we're going to go ahead and continue a pilot run of adding the error bars. They are calculated over multiple passes. So we take all of the data we've collected over the past year or two, really, and calculate the error, calculate margin of error, calculate the standard deviation, all that stuff, look at it statistically and determine what is the variance test to test, either from the game, from the OS, or whatever other variables are involved in the system. Thermal testing on the R5 1600X shows that using our Kraken X62 cooler, we're not in danger of encountering a clock throttle under torture workloads at any point during this test. This was not true for some of the previous Ryzen CPUs like the 1800X and R7 1700X units, which had high vCore out of the box and ran a higher temperature as a result. The 1700 and 1600X, however, are able to keep a flat clock when under thermal torture tests, including the 1500X, by the way. The sporadic lines at the front of the chart illustrate XFR prior to test execution, if you're curious. We're still working on running separate thermal tests for Ryzen, and we'll be publishing a complete standalone piece that completely defines thermals. We've worked with AMD on this as well as others, and that will hopefully put forward a complete picture of what Ryzen looks like for temperatures, because it's been very confusing thus far. As for voltages and power, the 1600X draws about the same power from the wall as all the other Ryzen chips expectedly, as does the 1500X. Under a Blender multi-threaded workload, the 1600X stock CPU clocks at 3.7 GHz across all cores when working concurrently on all those threads. And that runs a core voltage of about 1.17 to 1.2. Power draw is 145 watts constant with this workload compared to the 123 watts constant on the R5 1500X, same workload with its 3.6 GHz speed and 1.2 to 1.24 V-core auto-controlled. Comparatively, the 1800X drew about 185 watts in the same test, with the 1700X drawing 168 and 1700 stock CPU drawing 133 pre-overclock. Now, if you overclocked it, it'd be a bit more, and it would also equal the performance of the 1700X and 1800X CPUs. Let's move on to competitive benchmarks, starting with Blender, Premiere, and then move on to gaming. We're running our Blender tests using release candidate ready settings with 400 samples per pixel and 16 by 16 tiles. This is the optimal use case for Blender with CPU rendering, and one with which we're familiar from our own animations that we render in-house for the channel. As is known, Blender cares most about threads, and so there should be significant differences between the R5 12-thread and 8-thread chips here, despite likely minimal differences clock for clock in games. We're seeing the R5 1500X stock renders the 4K scene in 55.5 minutes, faster than the overclocked i5 7600K by about 7 minutes. That's an 11% reduction in total render time. The next closest CPU is the i7 2600K overclocked to 4.7 GHz, which completes the render in 54.5 minutes, really showing Sandy Bridges' prowess here. And overclocking the 1500X to 4 GHz leapfrogs the 2600K OC, landing at 50.7 minutes, at which point we're in Devil's Canyon i7 territory. The 1600X stock leverages its extra 4 threads here, completing the render in 36.8 minutes. Compared to the 1500X stock, that's a render time reduction of 33.6%. Note here that our R7 CPUs haven't yet been rerun at 3200 MHz, though you can see the memory benefit between the 2933 1700X OC and the 1700X OC with 3466 MHz. That should allow some extrapolation. It's not as important in this type of test as in some of the others. Price to performance, Intel's i5 CPUs don't stand up here. The i5 7600K overclocked to 4.7 GHz finishes its render in 62.5 minutes. The R5 1600X overclocked to 4 GHz finishes in 33.7 minutes. That's a render time reduction of 46% for roughly the same price. If you actually do plan to do some CPU-bound rendering, the R5 and R7 chips remain, as we have said from the get-go, the chief consideration at the price. Let's look to Adobe Premiere video rendering benchmarks now. We've included CUDA accelerated benchmarks as well, just to provide perspective for users who prefer CUDA accelerated rendering to software rendering. We are rendering an EVGA ICX review from the 1080 FTW2 that we uploaded on the channel. So that includes some features like color correction, some warp stabilization, things like that in there. We're running with a GPU for the 1600X, 6900K, 1800X, and 7600K, all of which land within a few minutes of each other when using the GPU to render. So the extra threads on the CPU don't help a whole lot. In fact, generally having a higher frequency helps keep the CPU up with the GPU, but overall we are no more than a few minutes apart, even from the 7600K to the 6900K. Looking instead to CPU rendering, the R5 1500X finishes the render in 114 to 126 minutes, depending on the overclock, which is 23.7% behind the 12-thread R5 1600X at 84 minutes. Compared to an R7 1700 overclocked, which we still think is the best buy of the R7 family, the overclocked R5 1600X is about 28% slower. If you want to see more benchmarks, we have POV-Ray, Cinebench, TimeSpy, and Firestrike on the website, linked in the description below, and those contain additional synthetic tests. Battlefield 1 is one of the games where we saw performance uplift following the recent patch 1.08, which improved performance on both Ryzen and Intel CPUs, by the way. Our Ryzen revisit showed R7 uplift, but did not revisit the Intel CPUs at that time. For this review, we've re-benchmarked the i7 7700K stock and overclocked, 7600K stock and overclocked, and the i5 7500 CPU. Other Intel CPUs have not been retested in this title and will so place a few percentage points lower on the charts than if they were retested. This is just a matter of time limitations at this point. All AMD chips and the most relevant Intel chips have been retested on the 1.08 build other than the FX series. The AMD R5 1500X places on the chart at 126 FPS average with lows at 81% low and 63 0.1% lows. Surrounding the 1500X, the Intel i5 4690K runs at 132 FPS average with 83 FPS 1% low and 72 0.1% lows. This plants the 4690K about 4.3% ahead of the 1500X when both are stock. The 1500X outperforms the i5 3570K Ivy Bridge CPU, which runs around 125 FPS average, and the i5 2500K when overclocked, around 124 FPS average. The i5 7500 CPU is AMD's closer price competition from this generation for the 1500X, and that operates at around 138 FPS average, 87 and 77 FPS lows. That lands the i5 7500 about 9% ahead of the 1500X, with a $10 increase in available price. The i3 7350K further reinforces our initial review's point that although the unlocked i3 CPU is really cool from the perspective of being an unlocked i3 CPU, the $180 price point doesn't make much sense, and that holds true when looking at both the 7500 and the R5 1500X. The 7500 or 1500X both make way better sense in this price gap. Looking at the R5 1600X now, the CPU places at 135 FPS average with lows at 98 and 86, just behind the R7 1700 stock CPU. This proves that games don't much care for the extra cores. In fact, you'd most often be better off losing some threads and just overclocking a cheaper chip if gaming is the desire. Overclocking the 1600X gets the CPU up to 136 FPS average at 4.08 GHz. I was clocked quite high, which is right around where the 1700X at 3.9 GHz with 3466 MHz memory landed. Given a $150 price disparity between the two, if gaming is your thing, the 1600X effectively invalidates the 1700X and 1800X in this title. We'll have to look at others for a better understanding though. Now, the update didn't only benefit AMD. Intel's i5 7600K also saw uplift, now placing at 144 FPS stock with 146 FPS overclocked. Battlefield 1 doesn't seem to care too much with our settings. That lands the i5 7600K stock around 7% ahead of the 1600X stock, with lows effectively equal. The overclocked 7600K is also roughly 7% ahead of the overclocked 1600X. Moving to Total War Warhammer, this is another game where game updates, not Windows updates, as some people seem to think originally, provided improvement for AMD CPUs. Upon running retests, we also saw performance uplift on those Intel CPUs, and we've designated the CPUs that were retested with an asterisk. CPUs lacking the asterisk would potentially see some performance uplift if retested. The i7 7700K is running into an external constraint as indicated by the lack of the overclock scaling. This is a limitation elsewhere in the bench, and you can see that by looking at the positive scaling between the 7600K and its overclocked variant. This means that a rough 190 FPS is our performance ceiling in this bench course with our config. The R5 1500X stock averages 142 FPS with lows at 85 and 73. This places the R5 1500X ahead of the overclocked i7 2600K at 4.7 GHz, running an average of 130 FPS with lows at 95 and 89, and markedly ahead of the i3 7350K in frame time performance. By comparison, the stock i5 7500, a locked CPU, performs at around 158 FPS average with lows at 94 and 85, thanks to the latest update. Before the update, this CPU struggled with low-end frame time performance. The 7500 leads the 1500X in average frame rate by roughly 11%. The 7500 also leads in average milliseconds between frames, but as this frame time chart shows, the difference is imperceptible to the end user. We're talking 85 versus 73 for the 1% slowest frames here. Not a huge difference at that point. Overclocking the 1500X gets the CPU to 151 FPS average, closing ground on the 7500. The 1500X outperforms the stock 1700X and 1700 once overclocked, and is effectively equivalent in average frame rate to the 1600X despite a slight frame time disparity. The R5 1600X stock performs equivalent to the 1800X stock, aiding the overclocked 1700 and further challenging the existence of the 1800X for our audience. The 1600X overclocked to 4.08 GHz outperforms the stock R7 CPUs, all of them, and is effectively equal in averages to the i5 7500, though outperforms the 7500 significantly in low values. By way of comparison, the overclocked i5 7600K is about 15.6% ahead of the R5 1600X overclocked in averages, with lows more or less equal. The non-overclocked i5 7600K does worse in lows than the R5 1600X stock, with averages maintained at 174 versus 151 FPS, favoring Intel. Watchdogs 2 has proven itself to be more reliant on thread count than other games on the bench to some extent, but does still care about clock speed. It's just that the i7 CPUs post a distinct advantage over the i5 CPUs, and so we should expect to see the same scaling or similar with Ryzen. The R5 1500X stock CPU performs effectively equally to the i5 4690K Devil's Canyon CPU and outperforms the i3 7350K at 5 GHz. This, again, further proves that the i3 7350K at its price is really not a good deal, in just the same way that the more affordable Ryzen chips are effectively invalidating the 1800X in gaming when considering overclocks. The 1800X at $500 doesn't make sense for gaming when you can buy an R5, overclock it, and get the same or very similar performance. Versus the price comparative i5 7500, we're looking at a frame rate of 80 FPS average on the 7500 non-K CPU, with the overclocked 1500X at 3200 MHz RAM landing at 75 FPS average. Considering the price difference and production advantage, assuming you run mixed workloads, this closing distance places the R5 chip in the best price to performance brackets of AMD's current offerings. Moving to the R5 1600X, this CPU lands at 84 FPS average, or about 15% ahead of the stock 1500X. Overclocking the 1600X gets it beyond 1800X stock levels, just below the overclocked i7 2600K levels, and nearing the i5 7600K 4.7 GHz tests 93 FPS average. The 7600K overclocked holds a lead of about 5% over the overclocked 1600X. Stock to stock, we're looking at a performance lead of effectively 0%. The 7600K and 1600X are equal when they are both stock. And moving now to Metro Last Light, useful as it hasn't been updated in years, which is nice, we see an interesting scenario that resembles the Total War Warhammer game scenarios just a few weeks ago. The i5 CPUs have trouble in frame time consistency with this game. They always have, and we've shown that for years at this point. And disabling hyperthreading on i7 CPUs reinforces that, though they do okay in averages. The R5 1500X stock CPU performs around 113 FPS average with lows at 78 and 63. This is similar to the stock i7 2600K Sandy Bridge CPU in both frame times and averages. Overclocking the 1500X to 4 GHz lands its performance right around where the stock R7 1700 sits. The i5 7500 CPU operates an average of 114 FPS with sporadic enough frame times to result in 30 FPS 0.1% low values. The R5 1600X, meanwhile, is effectively equal to an R7 1700X in performance, showing that for games where thread count isn't as relevant, which is most of them, there's not much tangible gain from an extra 4 threads on Ryzen. The i5 7600K overclocked nets an average FPS that is higher, but reflects the same sporadic frame time performance as the other chips discussed. Intel Core i7 chips, meanwhile, maintain a healthy lead in Metro Last Light, including the i7 2600K overclocked to 4.7 GHz. Let's just take a moment and point that chip out again. We did a revisit recently, and it's holding on very well. The R5 chips look good in this benchmark when compared to the price equivalent i5 chips from Intel. This first Ashes benchmark shows the old version of the game. The next chart will show the escalation update, which has fewer data points, but it has been tested to some extent. Ashes of the Singularity with high settings plants the R5 1500X stock at about 26.6 FPS average, 19.1% lows and 18.0.1% lows. This is effectively identical to the i7 2600K stock CPU in performance. Overclocking the R5 1500X to 4 GHz doesn't really gain much ground, moving to 28 FPS average, and we proved in our previous Ryzen Revisit piece that Ashes cares a whole lot more about memory overclock than core overclock. If you wanted a high mark in this game, you'd be better off investing your time in memory than core. We've left our 3466 MHz R7 1700X overclocks on this chart to illustrate that, though you should check the Ryzen Revisit content for a better understanding. Compared to modern CPUs, the Intel i5 7500 performs at 26.4 FPS average with lows from 18 to 20. This is, again, effectively identical to the 1500X stock CPU. The R5 1600X is a little more interesting, performing within 1.4 FPS of the i5 7600K stock. Overclocking both the 7600K and 1600X maintains a similar gap. The i5 7600K is now at around 32.6 FPS average, with the R5 1600X around 33.4 FPS average. More interestingly, the R5 1600X overclocks performs roughly equally to an R7 1800X stock, even with the same memory speed. Again, this further emphasizes our point that the R7 1800X is a bad buy for gaming at the price. If you are building a pure gaming machine, as stated previously, you're best off with either Intel, the R7 1700, or now one of the R5 chips. We'll talk about this more in the conclusion though. The 1700X and 1800X, as shown in this game and some of the others, don't offer very good value for gaming performance, particularly when considering overclocking the R5s. We haven't retested everything in Ash's escalation at this point. It's more AMD heavy than Intel heavy right now, since we just started running these tests with the R5 CPUs. The 1500X is now around 29 FPS average with lows in the 19 to 21 range. This is effectively equal to the i5 7500. Again, the R7 CPUs were rerun here, but we haven't put the 1600X through just yet. There's no argument here that for the price, Ryzen is the best competitor for render workloads on the CPU, though GPU accelerated rendering does still serve as somewhat of an equalizer when looking at even i5's, R5's, R7's, and i7's, as we show with the CUDA accelerated Premiere benchmarks. So if you use compatible benchmarks with GPU rendering, keep that in mind. If CPU rendering is your thing, then Ryzen 5 is well ahead of same-priced i5 CPUs from Intel. For gaming, Intel ties in some games like Watchdogs 2, or rather AMD ties Intel as it is the challenger here, and Intel is about 7 to 15% ahead in other games, averaging about 7 to 10. Anything more than that is less common, but does happen. And AMD, in this way, has closed the gap significantly compared to its R7 versus i7 launch that we already looked at. So to that end, it looks like R5 offers an even stronger argument for users who legitimately plan to do some sort of mixed production workloads. And when I say that, what we're talking about is looking at things like someone who might do some content creation for YouTube, maybe Twitch, or whatever, animation, in addition to doing some gaming. If you're not doing any animation, any production, and you're pure gaming, we have some notes for you later in this conclusion. Now, with regard to frame times, AMD's R5 CPU is at worst roughly equal to Intel's i5 CPU, and at best a good deal ahead in games like Metro Last Light or pre-update Total War Warhammer, though the update has shown that, yes, game updates can significantly improve frame time consistency on CPUs even when it's two different vendors, AMD and Intel in this case. Extra threads help over the i5 CPUs, but don't really do a whole lot for you over the R7 CPUs. So the extra 4 or so threads in R7, really not a whole lot of gain versus the R5s if you're looking at similar clock scenarios or overclocking. Over i5s, it is relevant, just like the i7 over i5s is relevant. It seems that 8 seems to be about where it matters, and also seems to be about where it stops in terms of relevance for the extra or high thread count CPUs. If you're purely gaming and not looking in $300+ territory, it's looking like R5 CPUs are close enough to i5s to really justify a purchase, if only because the frame times are either equal to competitive i5 chips in price, or at least slightly ahead, if not a good deal ahead, depending on the game. Now, this isn't always visible, as we've mentioned a few times now. If you're looking at 70 versus 85, when you're talking about the slowest 1% of frames, that's not necessarily visible or perceptible to the user, but it's a significant enough difference that it can matter and shows that it does matter in some games. If you are looking at something like an R5 1600X, overclocking it would more or less invalidate a lot of the R7 purchases for pure gaming. That does not hold true if you're doing something like Blender alongside gaming, but for pure gaming, the R7 CPUs, even the 1700, which we've liked, do not really make a whole lot of sense when you can get a competitive or comparable R5, 6-core, 12-thread or something like that, and overclock it. Those games won't really leverage the extra threads for the most part, though render tasks will. So it just depends on what you're doing. The 1600X over the 1700 would save you some money, and we would strongly recommend taking that money and putting it toward better RAM, because as we've shown in our Ryzen Revisit, getting something like 3466 megahertz memory or 3600, and I don't just mean the kits that you can buy, you have to actually put in a lot of work to get there, and make sure it's Samsung B-die. There are a lot of requirements here, so it's not just buy it and it works. But if you can get it working, it makes more sense to put the money toward the memory, because faster memory with your $70 or $80 savings from an R5 over an R7 CPU would put you further ahead than just getting an R7 CPU with lower price for the memory. Now, that said, you have to be careful not to venture into i7 7700K territory with your price. As soon as you're putting so much money into the R5 platform, memory, and all of that, that you're rivaling i7 territory and you're only gaming, it's looking like the i7 7700K is still the best gaming chip out of the ones we've tested, and that is done with 3200 megahertz memory quite easily. So yes, i5 CPUs still provide a decent experience for gaming especially, But even for gaming, it's starting to look like you're either buying a 7700K now because it is significantly ahead of the R5 CPUs and it's pretty well ahead of the R7 CPUs, or if you're not buying the 7700K CPU, you're buying an R5 CPU. We don't see much argument for R7s in gaming at this point, although there is an argument in some cases, and we also see a fading argument for i5 CPUs. The current juggernauts are, interestingly, the i7 7700K at the top end, and the R5 1600X, particularly with an overclock, which is quite easy to do if you're not pushing memory very hard. If you're already settling for an i5 from an i7, it's not much of a jump to go to an R5 and ensure better frame times going forward, and the average deficit is not that large, 7 to 10% on average, but you're still in good range for playable frame rates, and the frame times hold on quite well. The i5 is still a good CPU, don't get us wrong. It's just not compelling enough. It's not as strong as the i7 is against the R7. The i7 poses a very strong defense to the R7s in gaming. Going beyond 8 threads doesn't do a whole lot for your gaming experience, but as we've shown numerous times in i5 reviews, going beyond 4 threads does help in consistent frame time delivery. It's not required, you can still have a good experience without 8 threads in most games, but this is actually becoming a noticeable thing in some titles that we test. 16 threads don't matter as much and won't anytime soon, but again, 8 does. And if you buy an R5, overclock it, buy decent memory, it'll be competitive with Intel. Just again, be wary of venturing into 7700K territory because at that point, you'd be better off buying the i7. One final reminder here, it's not just cores doing this. If cores were the only thing that mattered, the FX series would have been a whole lot more competitive and less of a blunder overall. Looking at cores is kind of a difficult thing to do if you're just looking at the number. A core does not necessarily equal a core when you're looking cross-architecture. That is true for Zen, it's true for Bulldozer, and it's true for Intel. So when we're looking at the core count, people always talk about having a lot of threads available, having 8 threads, 16 threads. That's not all it is. It's having the threads available with an architecture that supports them for the task you are performing. For Ryzen, it's looking like these extra threads, 8 and onward, are a whole lot more valuable than they were on FX. And that's because of the architectural differences. It's because of extra floating point focus. It's because of better AVX improvements, as we talked about in the R7 1800X review in the article. So that's just kind of a thing. It's not just a core argument. Frequency matters too. Threads matter, but all of it comes down to the architecture and how it works together. And then we have some weird things like the Infinity Fabric and memory permitting some faster transactions when looking cross CCX. So every architecture has its own quirks. That's all for this one though. Hopefully that really sums it up for everyone. Check back soon for our continued VR benchmarking coverage that will be on the channel shortly. Thermal testing for the Ryzen CPU's GTX 1080 Ti AIB partner reviews, including MSI and Gigabyte. And make sure you subscribe for all of that. If you like our type of testing, as always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Gamersnexus.net for the full article. Store.gamersnexus.net if you're a fan and you want a shirt like this one. And that's all. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.